The rabbi that had the most impact on my life was Rabbi Byron L. Sherwin of blessed memory. He was my doctoral advisor at the Spertus Institute for Jewish Learning and Leadership in Chicago, and he was the protege of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And I was the recipient, I think, in so many ways, of the wisdom of Heschel transmitted through Rabbi Sherwin. It was an incredible experience for me to be able to sit at his feet. And one of the things that he related, unfortunately, he passed away in 2015, I think taken away from us too early. But one of the things that he related to us in one of the classes was that Heschel had opined that America had been wonderful for Jews, but terrible for Judaism. Now, Rabbi Sherwin had grown up at a time in which he communicated to us that he still remembered where he would see signs, when he was growing up, where it said no blacks and no Jews. And yet he believed that, of course, America had been a unique experience for Jews certainly in the West, not to mention Eastern European countries, but America had provided Jews with an incredible opportunity for political and religious freedom that had never been experienced before. And yet, the impact of that was, I think, very different in terms of the religious aspect. And what I mean by that is that if you look at the demographic studies of today, we realize that about a third of American Jewry has no religious affiliation whatsoever. That is, they're not a member of a synagogue, they don't really participate in any kind of religious observance. They might be cultural Jews at best, and that might be a big question in and of itself. But it's a sad reflection of the current state of American Jewry. On top of that, we see the conservative movement, for example, having shrunk tremendously. I think it represents something like 17%, or maybe a little bit more than that. For a movement that once maybe constituted 40% or so of the American Jewish community. So the amount of assimilation that we face in the United States is staggering. And that really was the heart of what Rabbi Sherwin and Rabbi Heschel were trying to communicate, that politically speaking, economically speaking, in terms of personal freedom, America had given this tremendous gift to the Jewish community. And yet, religiously, because of that warm embrace, there had been an unexpected byproduct, which in many ways is proving to be quite damaging to the welfare of, or the spiritual welfare of the Jewish community. Now, in last week's parasha Vayishlach, uh, Yaakov prays to Hashem that he protect him from the hand of his brother and the hand of Esau. It's sort of repetitive. Why does he mention the hand of his brother and the hand of Esau? Well, Esau represents everything that Jacob was not, right? The opposite of what he was. He was a man of war. He had 400 men with him, and Jacob was very much concerned that he would be attacked violently and that his clan, his family, would be destroyed physically. But it's interesting that he mentions the hand of his brother, and this is something that Rabbi Eli Mansour points out, and that is that Jacob, in many ways, was concerned that his brother might actually come to him in a state of reconciliation, in a way that would be embracing, and in a way that would be putting the past behind them and looking forward to the future. Now, what was the concern with that? Obviously, wouldn't anybody want to have reconciliation, forgiveness, and a better relationship with their brother? Well, the concern, as Rabbi Eli Mansour points out, was the fact that sometimes when an individual embraces another person, it can also have negative impacts, like what we saw in the case of America. America provided Jews with unquestioned liberty, but that liberty was taken by Jews as a point of assimilation, a point of abandonment for the Torah and the commandments, so the mitzvot. And of course, this again was something that was not necessarily envisioned, but it is something that has impacted us tremendously. Now, what's interesting in the struggle between Yaakov and the angel, or whatever entity that individual represents, whether it's Hasatan or the angel of Esau, whatever it is, it's interesting that in the battle, the angel or the entity is unable to conquer Jacob. And we read generally in the English text that he struck the hip socket of Jacob to debilitate him. But if you look at the Hebrew, vayigah is the word that's used for what we translate as struck, but that word simply means to touch. In fact, if you're familiar with the concept of shomer negia, it's that similar idea of not touching because intimately, because of propriety and modesty and so forth. And so what Rabbi Eli Mansour points out is that sometimes, if you will, Hasatan, uh, embraces us in a kindly fashion. He wants to show us that he's not our enemy, and the idea is basically to be our friend and to be our buddy, if you will. And of course, that was what Jacob was most concerned about, that intimacy with his brother, who had a very different worldview, a different philosophy, a different perspective, and a different commitment to Hashem, would ultimately bring about sort of the soft relaxation of his obligations to the covenant that Hashem had established with his forefathers, and of course continuing that with Jacob. And I think it's something very meaningful to us to consider. We live in a world of incredible freedom, and yet we see Jews who are so committed to every ism out there except Judaism. They're committed to every political perspective and every other, you know, idea that one might put out there that may have, beneficial perspectives or consequences to it, but they don't show the same kind of intensity that they do in their faith in God. And what happens over time is that that religious component, the lifeblood of the Jewish people, the covenant at Sinai, sort of gets put to the side and is no longer important. And I think that is what Heschel and Rabbi Sherwin were trying to communicate to us, that as much as freedom as we may have, it's always critically important for us to understand that there should be boundaries, that there should be a clear division between those who have a covenant with Hashem and those who do not. And while we want reconciliation, while we want peace, while we want amity with those individuals of different faiths and different cultural perspectives, we have an obligation to remain faithful to the covenant at Sinai. Now, I think it's interesting also if we look at the case of Haman in Persia and the Jewish community, you have a case of anti-Semitism, right? He hated Jews, he despised them. In the case of the Maccabees, they were confronted by the Seleucids, who did not hate Jews as Jews. They simply wanted Jews to accommodate their polytheistic vision of the world. They wanted Jews to show a measure of fealty and fidelity, loyalty to the kingdom by incorporating their sacrificial system, their cultic worship, into the cultic worship of the people of Israel. And so, from the perspective of the Seleucids, they say, well, we don't have a problem with this idea that you worship Hashem, but we just want you to sort of look at it from our perspective and sort of be pluralistic and embrace this, broader sense of acceptability and, sort of join in the club. And of course, this is what the Maccabees fought against. There could be respect, there could be some accommodation in terms of cultural perspectives, but religiously speaking, there could be no compromise. And I think that that is something important for us to remember at a time in which we find incredible freedom, but we also have incredible responsibility to uh, not only foster within ourselves, but also do that for our children and for their children as well.